Towards a New Socialism. Chapter 10. Foreign Trade. Beginning of quote. Two men can both make shoes and hats, and one is superior to the other in both employments. But in making hats he can only exceed his competitor by 1/5 or 20%. And in making shoes he can excel him by 1/3 or 33%. Will it not be for the interests of both that the superior man should employ himself exclusively in making shoes, and the inferior man in making hats? Ricardo, Principles of Political Economy and Taxation. End of quote. The socialist movement lacks a definite theory of foreign trade. Marx intended to write a volume of Capital on international trade, but he died before starting the task. On most questions to do with how to run a socialist economy, specific prescriptions from Marx are hard to come by, but at least he provides conceptual tools from his analysis of capitalism that can be reapplied to the new subject matter of the socialist economy. With international trade, we do not have even this. Marxian economic theory was generally derived from the theories of Ricardo, and in the absence of any specific Marxian theory of trade, the obvious starting point must be Ricardo. Ricardo proposed the idea that trade between nations arose from the differing comparative advantages that nations enjoyed in the production of commodities. It is important to understand what is meant here by comparative advantage. At first sight, it seems that an advanced nation with highly productive industries stands to gain little through trade with less developed countries. The German clothing industry can probably produce garments with less labor than the Chinese clothes industry. The German car industry can certainly produce cars with less labor than would be needed if they were both made by backstreet workshops in Shanghai. In both cases, Germany has a productivity advantage over China, but it is nonetheless economical to export Mercedes to China and to import cotton goods to Germany. This arises because of the greater relative productivity of the German car industry. Compared with hand assembly, the highly automated car factories of Mercedes may give, say, a 5-fold improvement in productivity. With the rag trade, the scope for improvements in productivity is not so dramatic. Although a German clothing firm might be more efficient, the advantage would not be so great as for the car industry. It thus pays Germany to concentrate its labor force in those engineering industries where it has the greatest advantage. Suppose that a Mercedes can be made with 1,000 hours of labor in Germany, and that a woman's blouse can be made with 1 hour. In China, let us suppose that a similar car would take 5,000 hours to build, and that a blouse could be produced in 2 hours. Based on the simple labor theory of value, the relative exchange values of Mercedes to blouses in Germany would be 1 Merc equals 1,000 blouses, while in China the relative values would be 1 Chinese luxury car equals 2,500 blouses. Given free trade, a capitalist who buys Mercedes in Germany, ships them to China, and brings back blouses will make a substantial profit. He will be able to undercut the more efficient German garment producers. The formation of a world market tends to equalize the relative prices of exportable commodities. The import of Chinese garments will tend to depress the price of clothes relative to cars on the German home market, and cheapen the price of luxury cars on the Chinese market. The specialization associated with trade means that the total world production of both garments and luxury cars can be increased. Figure 10.1. International Production Possibilities. Suppose the Germans have 100 million hours of labor that they can use either on car production or on the production of blouses, and that the Chinese have 400 million hours. Figure 10.1 shows that without engaging in trade with China, Germany can have either 100,000 cars or 100 million blouses, or any combination of these two constrained by the formula total labor equals cars times German labor per car plus blouses times German labor per blouse. China, on the other hand, can independently choose any combination of blouses and cars constrained by the formula total labor equals cars times Chinese labor per car plus blouses times Chinese labor per blouse. The world as a whole, if these are the only two countries, is constrained by both these relations. World car production equals German plus Chinese car production, and world blouse production equals German plus Chinese blouse production. As a result of these constraints, we have 1. Maximum world production of cars, MW cars. Chinese plus German maximum production equals 180,000. And 2. Maximum world production of blouses, MW blouses, equals Chinese plus German maximum production equals 300 million. Consider the point, MW cars and blouses, which represents production of 200 million blouses plus 100,000 cars. This is the combined world production which occurs when Germany produces nothing but cars and China nothing but blouses. It can be shown that there is no way in which so many blouses and cars can be produced if each country produces some of both goods. From a starting point with both countries completely specialized, let Germany decide to produce 90,000 cars and 10 million blouses, and let China decide to produce 10,000 cars and 175 million blouses. Total world production of cars will be unchanged at 100,000, but world production of blouses will fall from 200 million to 185 million. Any such move away from complete specialization diminishes production of at least one of the goods. This is the essence of Ricardo's argument in his parable about the shoemaker and the hatter. It is a particular example of the class of problems that can be solved by the mathematical technique of linear programming. International trade allows an increase in total world production as a result of specialization. This additional production constitutes a source of profit that does not depend upon the direct exploitation of workers. Mercantile capital was able to tap this source of profit in the ancient and medieval worlds, when direct production was under the control of classes of agrarian slaveholders or landowners. The ability of the trader to appropriate a share of the surplus was the foundation of the wealth of trading states like Rhodes and Venice. The labor theory of value developed by Smith, Ricardo, and Marx assumes that the equilibrium prices of goods within a country will be in proportion to their labor content. Footnote. It is beyond the scope of the present work to examine the validity of the labor theory of value as applied to market economies. An interesting modern assessment is given by Farjun and Mackover, 1983. End of footnote. What can it predict about world prices? Let us consider first the situation where the two countries have not yet fully specialized. In this case, the limits to the relative prices of the two goods will be set by their national labor values. In the previous example, the price of cars expressed in blouses will be somewhere between 1,000 blouses, as in Germany, and 2,500 blouses, as in China. It should not fall below 1,000 or rise above 2,500. Because both goods will be produced in each country, the less economical domestic product will be competing with a cheaper import. So the relative price of cars falls in China, and the relative price of blouses falls in Germany. The existence of two different price ratios is what gives rise to the international traders' profits. It is unlikely that both countries will specialize totally and fix output at that point, MW cars and blouses, in figure 10.1. It would be quite fortuitous should this output ratio for the two goods correspond to the ratio in which they are demanded. It follows that the equilibrium condition is likely to be one in which one country specializes totally, but the other continues to produce both goods. Under these circumstances, the labor value theory predicts that the exchange ratios of the goods in both national markets will be determined by the ratio of their labor values in the country that is not fully specialized. Hence, if aggregate demand for cars was greater than 100,000, whilst aggregate demand for blouses was less than 200 million, Germany would specialize completely in car production, and China would produce some cars and some blouses. In this case, the Chinese domestic price ratio would determine the world price ratio. German car producers would then earn excess profits through being able to sell their cars at the higher Chinese price. In the Ricardian theory, an essential role in the maintenance of balanced trade between nations was played by monetary movements. Suppose that Germany ran a trade deficit with China. In order to pay for imports, German merchants would have to make payments to their Chinese suppliers in Chinese currency. This currency could be obtained by exporting German goods, but if these were not being exported in sufficient quantity, Chinese currency would have to be purchased with gold or silver bullion. In meeting imports, a portion of Germany's stock of gold and silver would have to be exported. This would cause a shortage of currency on the domestic market and lead to lower prices. Domestic deflation would make imports relatively dearer and bring trade back into balance. Suitably generalized, this form of argument is not really limited to international trade. It is applicable to regional trade within a state. If Scotland runs a trade surplus with England, there will be a net flow of currency north of the border. This will lead to local inflation, higher house prices, etc. But it will also prompt a higher level of consumption, which will tend to eliminate the international trade imbalance. If there is a single set of prices for goods that are nationally traded, then on the same argument as for the international trade, one would expect regions to concentrate on the production of those commodities for which they have the greatest relative advantage. The classical theory of foreign trade is a very abstract account, and does not take into account many details of the modern world market. For instance, world monetary systems are no longer based on the gold standard as in Ricardo's day. Consequently, the elimination of trade imbalances by means of movements in gold or silver cannot operate. Credit money and speculative movements in response to changes in interest rates now allow chronic trade imbalances. When Ricardo was writing, international indebtedness with its systematic distortion of trade flows was unknown. Further, the idea of comparative advantage tells us little unless we have some idea why these comparative advantages arise. End of section.